Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Endeavour News. I'm your host, Hector, and I'm here with my co-host, Gilbert.
Hey, everybody. How's it going?
And we're also here with special guest, Jeff K of
Special
Western...
Jeff. I'll
Special
take it.
Jeff.
He is a special Jeff.
He is a very special Jeff, to be fair.
To be fair, he is.
Very special Jeff.
It's good to be back on the show.
Yeah, no, Jeff K of Western Allies Resistance. And we've also got Jeremy Rothe-Kushel joining us as well. Good to have you here, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you all.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. It's been a while. We're a little bit late, just a little bit of confusion on time zones, but we got here eventually. I'm just going to hand it over to Gil, and Gil will further introduce our guests.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Hector. I've been really looking forward to this. I'm very pleased to welcome two excellent guests to the show today, Jeremy Rothe-Kushel and our good friend Jeff K from Western Alliance Resistance. So Jeremy's work can be found at Expose the Enemy and The Antidote on YouTube, and Jeff K's analysis is available on Odyssey at Western Alliance Resistance. So both bring a depth of historical and geopolitical insight that's increasingly rare nowadays. So I highly recommend that you guys check out their work. Today's discussion will focus on the rapidly developing situation surrounding Iran and the broader Middle East, which has led us to this point, and what the likely implications are moving forward. So we're seeing a very complex landscape evolving, ongoing diplomatic tensions, shifting alliances, and differing responses from major global actors, including hesitation from parts of Europe and Asia regarding further escalation in this sphere. So the key question then becomes, how do we make sense of these developments within a larger strategic context? So with that, let's get into our first topic. So, yeah, Jeremy, you wanted to explore both the historical and conceptual macro frameworks. That is, what is the underlying structure or pattern people are missing when they look at the Middle East today? And, how did we get here? It's been a very long time coming, at least 20 years, and so much has happened in that time. So, let's why don't you show us, or let's discuss, how did we get to this point?
Well, there's a few different historical frameworks that are coming to an apex or to some kind of chaotic closure. And one of them goes back to 1979, which is, of course, the year that what's been called the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, when Ayatollah Khomeini was installed. And we can get into that in terms of the actual history, in terms of how this current Islamic Republic regime got into place there, and this specific one. But at the same year, we also have the beginning of the terror war, or war on terror framework, that Benjamin Netanyahu hosted at the Jerusalem conference in 1979, that drew together mainly the sort of Anglo-Americans as the epicenter of elite foreign policy thinkers, and put them into a framework that was largely under the umbrella of Netanyahu's Likud party framework that we're now seeing come to some kind of apex in terms of Iran. So that's one framework in terms of historical, some kind of loop being closed here. And we can go more deeply into the geopolitics of that from different perspectives. We could talk about the clean break paper that Netanyahu elicited or contracted from the more maybe Israel first, maybe militant neoconservatives in the United States, people like David Wormser, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, many of these people were part of the operation to launch the Iraq War in 2003, which was also part of this clean break framework. But I just want to close this intro by talking about two other maybe larger frameworks, historical frameworks that have come to some kind of looped close that I just thought about today in relationship to each other. The one I've mentioned before is that if you go from 1923 to 2023, you have a century from Jabotinsky's writing of the Iron Wall, which is the sort of the manifesto of what has become the power set in Israel, the revisionist political Zionists, and specifically what's become of the Likud party, to then October 7th, 2023. I've talked about many times how October 7th is Vladimir Putin's birthday. And the attacks on that day were acknowledged by what I saw a Hamas operative on an Arabic television as welcomed by the Kremlin and Moscow by creating a massive piece of chaos, a smokescreen actually, to draw American and more largely Western eyes away from the focus on Ukraine, supporting Ukraine against the aggressive Russian warfare. So, and the Israelis allegedly in response to October 7th, now there's a whole bunch of deep politics in terms of Netanyahu actually backing Hamas, the using the division between Gaza and the West Bank, even geographically, in addition to geopolitically, as a splitting the opposition kind of framework to make sure that there would not be a diplomatic or political solution to what's called the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then the Israelis launched what was called Swords of Iron. It was what we've now seen as almost a total destruction of Gaza. And so you have this century arc from Jabotinsky, 1923, the Iron Wall, to then Swords of Iron, launched in October 2023. The other century framework I think that we're looking at is that we're looking at the Soviet Trust, which was started, I believe, in 1917, which was the prototype really of what we're now beginning to see exposed more throughout the mainstream of like, what is a Dugin? What is the multipolar New World Order? Who are all these Russian syndicated operatives pushing, whether they're useful idiots or assets or agents of some aspect of the Russian project of some sort. Now to 2017, 1917 Soviet Trust to 2017, the launch of QAnon during the first year of Trump won. I believe that was in the fall of 2017, and I sort of see now what we're seeing from some of these kinds of information sources in terms of maybe Joe Kent now, leaving the government and saying this is all about Netanyahu dragging Trump into war. There's part of that is truthful. There's facts behind that. But then where does he go in terms of how to then talk about it? He goes straight to Tucker Carlson, who's maybe the main American journalist who glazed Putin and Dugin at a crucial moment in the war on Ukraine. And then Joe Kent then goes to Scott Horton out of the libertarian Ron Paul sector of the libertarian type of the right. And of course, all of this leaves out this really deep Russian-Israeli long-term strategic relationship, which always seems to serve each other in some kind of way. So those are the kinds of sort of long historical frameworks that I think are at work right now.
Wow. Okay. Fascinating. So this has actually been a lot longer in the making and has been cobbled together over a much longer time, as they've seen fit, and it seems to vastly predate like the clean break memo and Ode to Yunan and these types of documents. So that's really interesting. So in regards to that, you know, I guess more relevant to Iran, just, you know, are we seeing this continued interplay between Russia and Israel right now? Um, and I guess, how does the current moment, especially with Trump and MAGA, fit into that, historical trajectory? I mean, or I should say, Jeff, did you want to comment on that at all, or did you have any questions to what Jeremy just said just then?
I think he hit the nail on the head here. I think one of the main things that people always miss in these kinds of analyses is that, if you do not really know the fact that, if you have no idea about the perestroika deception, and if you believe that Russia and Israel are actually enemies and that Israel is indeed the greatest ally of the United States, I think you're going to miss out on a lot of aspects of, what is going on right now, which is why I would like to ask you actually, do you think that Russia may be the main beneficiary of the Iran war here?
Good question.
Was that for me?
Oh, yeah, I
Yes.
think that's for you.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks,
Yeah, it is.
Jeff. I think that they are definitely one of the biggest beneficiaries of this war, and that became pretty clear just maybe a week into it when Trump began to reckon with what the actual global economic blowback, and not just against the United States, but against many of our allies, whether in Asia or in Europe, especially in terms of oil and natural gas, and even some of the maybe higher level products like helium, for example, that largely come out of Qatar, I believe, which are deeply involved in very high level industrial processes all the way on up to chip manufacturing, but also things like MRIs and hospitals and all of that. And so Trump basically said, well, we're going to relax against Russia and allow Russia to sell oil against the sanctions. Basically, it'll just be temporary. And this is how one way that we're going to try to ease the hit against both the American and global economy in terms of the very obvious to see blowback from what was going to happen if you attempted a decapitation strike against the Iranian regime. So yes, I think in many ways I see it as just a very clear repetition on an even bigger scale than uh, Putin's birthday present on October 7th of 2023, when Hamas had been in Moscow just the year before, and it was they basically stated it on television. The Kremlin welcomes this kind of chaos and catastrophe. So I think obviously Russia is benefiting from this, at least in the short term. And it's definitely, and even in the long term, I think this, in a certain way, this does begin to feel and look like a capstone type of event of what my suspicion is the longer term reason for the Trump MAGA operation from an American perspective, which was largely to reorder the world in a way that suited long-term multipolar new world order interests, including Russia and China, and also suiting their relationship with a specific form or individuals and institutions inside of Israel. So I think that that is a key piece of what's actually de facto going on right now. Is people, some of the copers in terms of people who are trying to stick with Trump MAGA and say we got this and all that, they're saying, well, this is a very strategic attack against China because China's the most dependent on this oil. And it's partially true. China basically took over the Iran file in a deeper way from Russia. because Russia, it became obvious Russia was more closely sympathetic and had some kind of strange loyal relationship with Israel than they did Iran. And this came on the record after Israel voted with Russia against Ukraine in the UN, and after last year's Midnight Hammer attacks, and Putin was asked, why didn't you protect you? We thought you were allies, security partners with Iran. Why didn't you protect them from the aggression of the Zio-American Empire and all these kinds of things? You know,
Allies, all of Russia's allies just always seem to fall apart, and they never do anything. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Very true, and that's an interesting question too. Is like that because there's this aspect of like where I would say if there's an aspect, if you take a sort of maybe a 20th century Cold War, maybe a semi-crude anti-communist perspective of what's going on, you see sort of a mopping up of these sort of Anshan regime, Soviet kind of backed satellites of some sort. There's a part of that that's true, but then if you then read the quote unquote end of the Soviet Union via something I would say beyond the perestroika deception, and maybe we can get into even the question about Golitsyn versus Nosenko, and potentially I believe, some kind of weaponized Soviet dialectic actually to try to put Golanowski in a box, who was the earlier and I think way more valid, basically Polish whistleblower turned agent into the United States, who did tons of very serious identifications of Soviet agents all around the world before Golitsyn came in and worked with Angleton to talk about and really cover up the monster plot, which had already taken over the CIA at an even higher level. So that's in the background. But if you just take some kind of perestroika deception idea around this, in terms of the Soviet Union did not really fall apart. It did geopolitically on the surface, but at the very same time in the 80s, you had Robert Maxwell working with basically the Russian deep state, training Semyon Mogilevich up into being able to create what became Soviet front financial organizations and instruments all around the world to push $50 billion of washed Russian organized crime money in very influential ways all around the world in preparation for the alleged fall of the Soviet Union. You can see that maybe we're actually in a similar kind of moment right now, where there's a transformation happening of the Russian sphere of interest. And in many ways, you could say that it has to do with the actual creation of the new multipolar world order, and then trying to fit a new American version into that new multipolar world order. And so that's my suspicion. That's my concern about what's actually going on with what we're seeing as a sort of aggressive Trump foreign policy that goes for quick decapitation strikes, and then this idea that we're just sort of mopping up all of these former Russian allies. And so maybe last thing I'll say is that there is this deep history of Iran that represents, I think, actual real blowback in terms of the Cold War period, because the best research that I've seen actually comes from an Iranian nationalist, Farah Mansour, who did all of the work to knit all of this together and source it out, that basically showed that elements of CIA, mainly focused around people like Richard Helms on into George H.W. Bush, knew about the potential about it in the mid 70s, 75, 76. And then they actually kept this from the incoming Carter presidency, and actually were able to manufacture the entire Islamic revolution, and at least in terms of where it ended up, because people will remember that there was an organic kind of revolution happening at the time of the fall of the Shah, but a lot of it was then filtered into bringing in Ayatollah Khomeini And then the whole idea of the hostage crisis is not only engineered to last 444 days until Carter was out and Reagan came in, but Farah Mansour basically sources out that the entire thing was manufactured at a very high level, and likely in order to try to create a bulwark against the Soviet Union. And so, and this is why I think there is this aspect of that Iran in current day is actually some kind of blowback to this element who saw themselves as hard-nosed Cold Warriors, but ended up actually weakening the American position in a similar kind of way that I think the Cold Warriors who were part of the operation to take out Kennedy did the same kind of thing because of their preemptive aggression. So that's just my understanding of the history there, and I'm willing to take pushback or questions on it.
Damn. Well, you've given me a lot to. I actually don't know where to begin with that. Jeff, did you want to ask any questions, or Hector? Because I'm very bullheaded. I wanted to get into the next node or talking point topic, but is Jeff or Hector? Did you want to? I certainly have my questions, but either of you want to jump in on that? That was really that was quite revelatory to me. It's sort of like every time Jeremy talks, it's like a new revelation to me. Sorry, I don't.
I'll let Jeff go first as he's our
Yeah,
guest.
Jeff,
But I'll just have some minor questions to that. But I'll let Jeff have his
Sure.
Jerry's thoughts first.
Yeah, something that I was wondering what you think of is you mentioned Joe Kent as well, and within an hour after this, this letter he wrote and his resignation, he was already booked on the Carlson show. And as soon as it came online, hundreds of accounts started to post the same clip with the same message, like, "Oh, the Israelis drove the decision to take this action, which we knew would set off a series of events because the Iranians would retaliate." Now, there really seems to be two reactions to this Iran war here, which is which is by far the most promoted one, is that the US is just doing the bidding of Israel. The other one is where people who are aware of the multipolar threat, let's say, as we discussed, or Eurasian expansionist threat, whatever you want to call it, they actually seem to be celebrating it because it will be, some kind of death of the Eurasian Empire or whatever. So my question is, what if they're both wrong, right? What if this is, like we said, actually the case that Russia is a very large benefactor here? And what if this is like some kind of final conclusion of Operation SIG, where they kind of like try to focus the entire blame on Israel, while it's actually the Russians who wanted this to happen? Because it is quite interesting to me how, like I said, all these bot accounts are posting this exact same clip, and it's always the same people who promote the same anti-NATO rhetoric, anti-Ukraine rhetoric. So what do you think of that line of thought there?
I think there's a lot to that. And I do think that both of those camps are wrong, like you say. And I think that a lot of this has to be understood in relationship to narrative warfare and long-term weaponized dialectics. And so there is this aspect, at least in a narrative framework, where Operation SIG is coming to fruition. And so then that's when you have all of the so-called axis of resistant type of shills and bots online saying Israel's getting their comeuppance because they've controlled the Yankee empire for so long, and they finally got the Yankee empire into a situation that they can't handle for their either, controlled dog or their patron, whichever way you want to go about it. Now, you have certain kinds of axis of resistance. If they're sort of more crude Marxists, they'll basically argue against this idea that Israel was crucial to this decision to attack Iran by basically saying, no, this is always the Anglo-American Yankee empire and their Zionist Project Satellite that's always just serving crude imperial interests. Now that kind of analysis very obviously breaks down in terms of what we've actually seen, the real blowback to, even if you want to call it the Anglo-American Empire, especially post clean break wars. It's very obvious to everyone, that the Iraq War did not serve American interests, whether economic and definitely not geopolitical, let alone the idea of American leadership in terms of international law, the perception of the United States as a good actor in the world, and all of those things. And so it's clear that element is wrong about this. It's also clear that the other side is also wrong in terms of that this was not about Israel. This was very much about Israel. This was very much about the clean break doctrine, the capstone of the almost 50-year arc of the war on terror that was largely driven both in epistemology, but also just in hard-nosed geopolitics by Benjamin Netanyahu. Even everyone's willing to admit right now, including Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, head of CIA, Ratcliffe, that what the Trump people are saying was the threat incoming was that the Israelis were going to attack the Iranians, and then there was going to be an immediate Iranian response that would involve the Americans. And so it's very clear that this is very Israeli-centric. It's very clear that the Israel lobby was at the core of the Iraq War. They were not the only reason for it, but they were a core reason. They were necessary, but maybe not sufficient. And it's the same kind of thing now. And so what that then suggests is that we have to then complete the weaponized dialectic in terms of understanding, well, what is the weaponized part of the Soviet dialectic from Operation SIG? It hasn't been named, but it's obviously been operating for many, many years, probably back through the origins of the Israeli state itself. And so I'll just touch a couple points that are obviously the case. One is that early on, the Israeli leadership was more of the what you might call maybe the center-left variety. Ben-Gurion, Labor Party, Shimon Peres. But even in those days, in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, 1954, for example, you have Ben-Gurion leaving the government. The second prime minister of Israel is named Moshe Sharett. In his diaries, it became clear that Ben-Gurion went behind Moshe Sharett's back to work with people like Moshe Dayan and other elements that really geopolitically become what the Likud party is, to actually do false flag terrorism in Egypt, which was known as Operation Susanna in 1954. It becomes known in the cover-up as the Lavon Affair. But what you note is not only did that failed false flag where they had Jewish assets on the ground in Egypt that were going to firebomb British and American civilian cultural targets, including movie theaters, post offices, libraries, these kinds of targets, to try to, what is disclosed in the book about this, Israel's Sacred Terrorism by Lydia Rokosh, based on Moshe Sharett's diaries. They were trying to frighten the West, to really terrorize the West into supporting Israel against what they saw as their Arabic regional nemesis. But what actually happened out of that is crucial, because at that point you had President Eisenhower had covert negotiations going on. I believe it's called Project Alpha or Operation Alpha, where he was tasking his CIA to do covert diplomacy between Moshe Sharett in Israel and Nasser in Egypt in order to resolve their tension, Egypt and Israel. So we could have seen a resolution of that tension maybe, at least 30 years earlier or something like that. but also beginning to talk about a resolution to what's called the Palestinian question or the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so instead of all of that happening, this was all disrupted. This all was destroyed. All of this American-led covert diplomacy was destroyed. And Nasser not only immediately revokes any participation in this in terms of any negotiations with Israel, but he then also pulls his relationship with the United States and immediately turns to the Soviet sphere for backing, for geopolitical backing, for military backing, and all of that. And so I use that as an early example for it appears that there is some kind of, like at that point, Soviet-led interests that are served when these certain kinds of terrorist elements inside of Israel, on up to the prime minister or former prime minister at that point, do these kinds of false flags that from their own impetus are designed to try to frighten the West into supporting their what then become things like Oded Yinon plan or clean break attempts to try to divide and conquer or sow chaos in their region so that they will ascend to regional hegemony.
Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, there's a couple of things I would like to ask about that, but Hector, you actually said that you wanted to ask some little questions. Did you
Yeah,
want to still ask that?
okay,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
this one's sort of, we're going back a bit because we talked about the Iran war, right, and the obvious consequences of that. Do you think, like, the Trump administration, like, at this point even thought about these consequences? Like, what was the actual end game going on with Trump and the people around him? Like, what did he think it was? And how, like, how does this war or conflict come to a situation where it can come to a satisfactory end in the eyes of the Trump administration? And is that even possible at this point?
Well, it's a very good question. And in the days after, I was actually saying, well, Trump, if he realizes that he's gotten in basically over his head in terms of this, he should actually do what George W. Bush did, but then call it good, which was declare victory,
Declare victory.
on an American aircraft carrier, and then go home. But the problem is that, as you pointed out, this had to have been, at the very least, the American military and intelligence. They knew all of this was coming. They prepared for it. I'm sure they informed Trump to some extent that this was very likely going to be the situation. Now, is it possible that there were too many yes men around Trump that were not really warning him intensely about, okay, yeah, it's very likely the case that the Iranians are not going to just crumble after they're decapitated. I mean, none of this makes sense if you have any sense of the history of Iran, even pre-Islamic regime, because it's a very long nation. It is a very proud nation in many ways. Some of the diplomatic, what might be seen as games that the Iranians were playing around the question of nuclear refinement and all of that was really about just not wanting to go the Libya route,
Yeah.
nor the North Korea route. And so in a certain way, it's almost feels like there are deep forces that are actually trying to go the North Korea route with Iran to sort of make Iran even more extreme. And so this is one of the reasons why I think there are these elements of Netanyahu Israeli interests that are deeply driving some of this in a certain way, because that is their MO. They seek to have what can be called a nemesis that is too extreme, too terroristic to engage in actual political negotiations or political solutions with, which is one of the reasons why they backed Hamas, up until October 7th, basically. So I think that the American military we do not have ineffective military. They think through all of these things. The intelligence at its core knows this history. They know what the some of the blowback will be. So I know that this was on the table to some extent, that this was going to happen, because a lot of this makes game theory sense. Now people are trying to frame it as the Iranians are going nuts and lashing out at all of their potential, other regional rivals in the GCC, in the Arabic world, but they had all of this, game theoried out in terms of a potential decapitation strike,
Well,
and a lot of
oh,
yeah.
sorry. It's like, what did they expect? I mean, Iran's already targeted military bases in other Middle Eastern countries before, so obviously they got to do it again. So it's it just
And
doesn't.
it is interesting because the whole question of it began to come out into the press that the Russians were helping the Iranians with certain kinds of targeting, right? Although the Russians are not overtly helping the Iranians, and nor are the Chinese, they are both helping them with very likely things like geospatial
Intelligence, yeah.
intelligence and targeting intelligence and all that. And what has still not been asked directly is, are the Chinese and or especially the Russians helping the Iranians target the Israelis? Because that was, in at least in terms of the mainstream, what we've been told by the government and all of that, this was the Israelis led the way on this. Now there are some inklings that, at least inside of the Trump White House, that there was an idea that it would look better for the Americans if the Israelis led the way on this, and so we could make it seem like we were being dragged into this. And now that is probably partially true, especially if they decided to go to this kind of scale. But it is very clear that it's the Israelis and the Iranians who are the main nemesis in this kind of thing. And the United States, for many decades, has said, yes, we do not like what the Iranians have been doing, basically, since they became an Islamic regime throughout the 80s, and then in the post-Iraq War era, where they were working with certain Shia aspects in Iraq to target American soldiers. But even that is pretty well known. Like, it came out that there was NSA chatter, that even the neocons guy, their go-to guy, sort of like the Pahlavi of Iraq, Ahmed Chalabi, who was said to be, he was going to potentially take the reins in Iraq after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, that he was on NSA wiretaps, basically looking like an Iranian agent. So in some way, I do see that this is sort of the Iranians and the Israelis have this long-term kind of beef. And so I do see that there's an aspect of the blowback of 1979, if it were to have been engineered by certain Bush CIA elements behind the back of Carter, that it was not only blowback in terms of then the evolving Iranian-Russian relationship, especially after the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, but also in terms of that you could see that George H.W. Bush was not a big fan of the Israelis, actually. There's chatter that he was targeted for assassination, potentially. He and James Baker were actually tried to hold the line on certain elements in terms of settlements and certain Israeli hardlines. So you can imagine a situation where they actually thought, all right, we'll actually put someone in Iran who will not only be a bulwark against the Soviets, but will also create a certain amount of balance in the region against the Israelis, who we have enough problems trying to, hold back on some of their more extreme elements.
Okay, amazing. So if I'm reading what you're saying, maybe a big question becomes, what really is Iran and all of this? And I think you've kind of described that, um, did, quite deeply. But is to put it more succinctly, is Iran kind of, would you say it's kind of functioning like a Syria in the Middle East, in that that there is sort of this strange stuff going on in Iran, and that there is sort of seems to be a balance of power that is being maintained between the great powers, and that seems to be being brokered between Israel and Russia. So is the same sort of Syria model being employed for Iran, or is this am I is this not the same thing, and it's a completely uh, different animal? Guess it probably differs quite vastly for Syria, or I'm not really sure. And then I want to get into some Trump stuff, but yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Jeremy, or any of you guys?
Well, I think you're correct actually, that Syria, if you were to think about this as clean break,
Sure.
and the problem is that a lot of these people who are now sort of, especially sort of the newer anti-Israel critics, and some of the older ones too, that are very Russian sphere, people like Ryan Dawson, those types of people. For some reason, they continue to not even have read this is like 5 pages of the clean break document, because it very clearly distinguishes between the strategy in Iraq, where it calls for a regime change war, TM, like Tulsi Gabbard. Remember, Tulsi Gabbard made her name on up into this current Trump White House by talking about I'm against regime change wars, TM, and in so doing, actually obscuring that the clean break war in Syria was totally distinguishable from the clean break war in Iraq, and that it called for regime change in Iraq, but it called for rollback, and especially of a trying to roll back the chemical weapon deterrent that the Syrians had, and that was effectively accomplished pretty early on in the Syrian dirty war. And what you'll note is that people all the way from Joe Kent to, I think, even when he went straight on to Tucker Carlson, like you were talking about, that they both get this wrong. They both talk about how the Israelis were interested in the overthrow of Assad. They were not. The Israelis were actually aligned with the Russians and Iranians after al-Shara came to power in Syria, mainly backed by the Turks and a bit of the Qataris and the Americans. And the Israelis and the Iranians and the Russians, right after there was a new, actually, national Syrian government that was trying to knit the pieces back together again, all three of them, Russia, Israel, and Iran, came in to try to destabilize once again the Syrian nation, each in their own ways. And so I do think that at least the Netanyahu type, the clean breaker plan here is much more Syrian than it is Iraq. And although they may be in the back of their minds, they had some kind of fantasy, some kind of dream of being able to install Pahlavi or something like that. But that sounds similar to me about what the dreams that the same clean breakers had after the Iraq War, where they thought they were going to be able to quickly re-implement the Kirkuk, Iraq to Haifa, Israel pipeline. And sure, they might have wanted to do that, but it turned out it was a little more difficult than that. But I do think that in general, Syria is the model for what the clean breakers want in Iran, which is a severe rollback of Iranian deterrent capacity. Because as you'll know, it wasn't that the Iranians were going to preemptively attack American targets or Israeli targets. No, the danger was that the Iranians were going to react to an attack on themselves. So I think that this is actually the real model here, is that they seek to, from their own perspectives, understandably want to dial back Iranian ballistic response capacity to Israeli hegemony in the region. Because remember, a lot of this has become escalated after the alleged Israeli response to October 7th, in terms of basically decimating Gaza, basically killing maybe, probably at least 5% of the population, maybe heading towards a real decimation of 10%, but definitely destroying almost all of the human infrastructure to a serious capacity. And that's, of course, when then you create a lot of regional blowback, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen to Iran and all of that. And so a lot of this is the chaos that was waged via these clean breakers.
Okay. I have a that's very interesting. It's kind of almost like reminds me of Victor Ostrovsky and the Dawsons, the Gabbards. They're all like these mini kind of KGB agents in a way that Ostrovsky described, and that same model seems to be basically the repeated with some perhaps slight permutations, but kind of not real. I mean, the main crux of it all seems to be the same, that this sort of has been the history of the Middle East. But I just have a random question to throw out there in terms of I know I said I wanted to get to Trump and more into the sort of Trump movement and Trump network. But as a random question, so how do you guys think that Russia viewed the Abraham Accords? Because before October 7th, many speculated that this event was in response to Israel trying to normalize relations with the Arab states. And then from that, many said that this was like an attempt by the pipeline, the sort of underground network pipeline that would lead its way back to Tehran and Moscow to sort of agitate for this a hotbed of terrorist activity, an explosion of terrorist activity that culminated in October 7th, which led to the, if I have it correctly, the sort of breaking of the Abraham Accords and other plans that they had to solidify Israel's position in the Middle East. So sorry, I kind of rambled there for a bit, but is there something there, like where does that come into play, and how does Russia and maybe Tehran view that? And I guess I wonder if that they also felt that, because presumably that would not run counter to the Silken Road initiative. I'm sorry, I've said enough. Can I sort of just give that to you as a question now, Jeremy? Is that possible for you to do something with that?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's a crucial question, and I do think that on the surface that both the Abraham Accords that came coupled with the Kushner-led approach to what was called New Palestine, or what was concomitantly basically called a strategy to end the Israel-Palestine conflict, that those happen at the same time in many ways. And they are both related to deeper elements of both the war on terror, even this phrase of peace through strength from the 80s really continued on into this moment that is both embraced by Trump and Netanyahu, but also into the clean break, that the idea, and this was then encapsulated by Netanyahu, and Netanyahu put out his own autobiography just in the last years and went on a speaking tour around it. Basically, Netanyahu proclaimed that the Abraham Accords were an extension of what he had been calling for, this idea of transcending the Palestinian question, transcending what was called the stalemate of the so-called the Israel-Palestine peace process, or the idea of trading peace for land, right? It was like, no, not peace for land, peace through strength, which was the idea too in Clean Break. I believe they also talk about being able for Israelis to go uninhibited into Palestinian lands. And so I do think that there's this aspect where it was an attempt to try to transcend the Palestinian question. And although Kushner has been asked directly about this, because there were some of us, there was a lot of people actually saying, like, it looks in a certain way that the attempt to throw the Palestinians under the bus uh, by Kushner, especially when he was given the Israel-Palestine file under Trump 1, that this, in certain ways, the blowback was October 7th by Hamas in certain ways. Now, I think that's a very limited level of what actually happened, but it's part of what the intent was on the Hamas side of things, is that they intended to be like, oh, okay, Israel's going to create so-called peace with all of our Arab neighbors, especially sort of heading toward the Saudis, which before the Iranians claimed the Palestinian file for the Muslim world during the 80s to some extent, the Saudis were seen to have been the sort of major part of the Muslim world that would look out for the Palestinians and would refuse to make full-on peace with Israel until the Palestinian account was really settled. And so there was this aspect of the Palestinians, especially Hamas leadership, that saw, well, this is our last moment before there's all this economic reform and economic peace relations between the major Arab powers and Israel, to be able to disrupt this and say, well, what about us? We still don't have a nation state. We still don't have a real seat at the political or economic table. And Kushner's approach, his proposal, was actually a very manipulative sort of. It was a sort of an imperial kind of approach to it. Was the idea that the Palestinians wouldn't really get a state; it would be sort of a smart rumplet corridor that would basically provide a bunch of cheap labor to the surrounding wealthy Arabs and to American financial institutions to some extent. And so there is this aspect of that level of October 7th and aspects of what's then come of Iran is blowback to both the combination of the Abraham Accords and the Kushner proposal for Israel Palestine. Now, after Trump won, Biden came in and tried to continue on with the Abraham Accords, and didn't really ever stop back to be like, well, what about this question of the Palestine file and all that kind of thing? And part of that, I think, was the idea of like the IMEC corridor, an alternative, a competitive approach to the Chinese Belt Road Initiative, and all of that, and so all of this sort of blew up in everybody's faces. At the same time, I believe this does serve what Netanyahu's longer strategic interests were, which was to create situations where he could be seen as legitimately responding in a way that sought to transcend his regional nemesis, whether in Gaza or in Syria or in Iran and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think, the presence of both, well, all these major plans for the Middle East to sort of terraform it in the image of these great powers. I mean, perhaps it is indicative of some factionalism that exists in Israel, and that Israel is playing this sort of power broker role in the Middle East, which again kind of shows that these competing interests aren't actually really contradictory at all. I mean, you roll these plans out in the hopes of almost seeing what they'll do, how time and events will react to these plans, and it's not just reacting to geopolitical events; it's actually taking part in forming them. And by the looks of it, it seems that even in spite of these attempts to normalize itself with the Arab neighbors, that to me at least, Israel's ascendancy in the region remains somewhat straight and narrow, without really much. I don't really see, what is going to if to prevent it from either way achieving that hegemony, that it that the clean break memo and other documents suggest, and certainly their posturing. Yeah, it's difficult for me to say, but what is going to. I mean, if anything, you've got these great powers rallying behind them in a way, trying to solidify their success or maybe that's a little bit too much to say it in that way. I should perhaps be a bit more subtle, because then people will bring up all these, well, that's inconsistent with this, but I mean, anyway, that I don't want to get into, I don't want to dive into the weeds about that, but yeah, it is.
Can I say something real?
No,
I'll try
absolutely.
to be quick.
Yeah.
We were talking about before about how does Russia benefit from this action in Iran, and in a certain way, obviously, there's those short-term things that remind me of October 7th and Israel and Gaza, but there's longer-term aspects that also, I believe, fit into the larger framework of why Trump MAGA over the long term in terms of these Russian multipolar interests, because in a larger way, what the Israeli war in Gaza did was not only take American and Western eyes and split backing away from Ukraine, it made Putin's in criminal invasion of Ukraine look sort of a little more mild in relationship to what Netanyahu did in Gaza to some extent. And so I believe that this is the first time that Israel has publicly assassinated the leader of a country. Okay, I believe that there's other times in history where they have done the same thing. Some of them actually happened in the United States, very likely. They weren't the only ones, but they were deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination. However, it's never been admitted. It continues to be controversial and all that. So this is the first time that we've ever seen Israel proclaim to have assassinated the leader of a nation state before. And it's in collaboration with the United States in a war that reminds a lot of people of the Iraq War, which is now largely seen as not only wrongful, but also bad foreign policy in relationship to geopolitical blowback against the American interests. And so there's this aspect of this that actually I think is meant, and serves directly not only Russian multipolar New World Order interests, but also the Chinese interests in relationship to all of this. And then also specifically the Russian and Chinese very specific relationship with Israel in the future and through the past, which is people, obviously both the Russians and Chinese took full narrative advantage of the growing, criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza by unleashing all kinds of things on TikTok. The Russians with their networks of sort of Israel evil uber alles kind of things, all these kinds of networks that we're now sort of seeing come to a head right now. They obviously took narrative warfare advantage of that, but realpolitik, they actually increase their economic relationships with Israel, both of them, China and Russia. Now, China had been pushed back a little bit under Trump 1, under Pompeo, who attempted to discipline the Israelis a little bit in the economic relationship with China. China had basically taken over the port of Haifa in Israel, and there was some pushback in relationship to these very overt economic ties between Israel and China. And I have noticed that just early in this year, I think January of 2026, that the Chinese, for the first time, basically kicked all Israeli cyber technology out of the country. Whereas for decades, the Israelis had been the main cyber contractor in China, at the very least in terms of their commercial and civilian surveillance programs and all of that kind of thing. And so there is a certain kind of move where the Russians and the Chinese are still very deeply involved with Israel, but they seem to be creating the same kind of relationship that people thought that the United States had with Israel.
Yeah.
The idea of like it's a sort of we're their patron or something like that.
Mm, mm. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah, you can keep going if you want to, but yeah, that
The
yeah.
last thing I wanted to say was that I think it's actually the big thing that would benefit Russia and China in terms of this U.S.-Israeli action in Iran is the sort of maybe the final big overthrow of the post-World War II international order, what's now sort of disparaged as the rules-based order, that kind of thing. And I mean, the United States took advantage of our win in World War II to actually claim leadership in world affairs. And then that is what President Kennedy was really up to at a very high level. Was he was beginning to implement an architecture, strategic architecture to win the Cold War based on American principle and power. So instead of peace through strength, peace through power, because strength is now being interpreted as some kind of very public bullying operation.
Right.
That seems more like mob tactics of some sort. It reminds me of like what the neoconservative, the guy who wrote the book with Michael Flynn.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name. I can see his face. I think he died a few years ago, but he talked about how the United States should utilize its power every so often by picking up a tin pot dictator and basically pummeling them in front of the world. And this is sort of how the United States, how we got ourselves into a problem, especially in the 21st century, was by following this kind of neoconservative idea of what the unipolar moment should be. And in many ways, it was in service of our alleged ally in Israel. And so I think it makes sense to rethink these kinds of dialectics of when it makes sense that people are like, oh, Russia is a nemesis or an enemy. Israel is an ally or a great friend or a partner. And so once you do think about things that way, you'll almost always miss the potential of a backdoor channel or orthogonal threat via things like flipping of like friend and foe signals, which is things that I think that the Israelis have been involved with, even in terms of Iran, is a potential cyber attack when the Iranians shot down a Ukrainian airliner after Trump assassinated Soleimani. And I always notice, like, wow, a Ukrainian airliner, and this is what, 1 year before or 2 years? 2 years before the invasion of Ukraine. And it just so happened that the Iranians mistakenly shot down a Ukrainian airliner that had even some of their own Iranian scientists on board. And then it turned out that the Iranians had actually sort of covertly accused the Russians of supplying backdoor cyber keys to the Israelis for the Russian supplied counter-aircraft weapons that had been supplied to Iran. And this was supposedly in exchange for the Israelis supplying the Russians with backdoor keys to Israeli drones that had been supplied to the Russians for their Georgian dirty war. And so there's this aspect, I think, that if we were able to think through this idea, like in a cyber context, of the idea that you could have a backdoor switch that would flip friend and foe identification systems, I think we would begin to understand the actual deep geopolitics of what Israel has actually, at least some element of Israel, and a very strong ascendant element of Israel from Ben-Gurion on up to the reign of the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon, the way that that element in Israel has actually served as a foe pretending to be a friend in a direct conduit back toward, in that case, Soviet interests.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
do
Go.
you think something similar goes for Trump? Because, you kind of alluded to the fact that he's sort of like reorganizing the US sphere of influence in order to more align with a multipolar world. So the question is, why would he do such a thing?
Exactly. And, so a lot of this is done under the guise of a resurgent American hegemon, but almost all of it is done as the idea of putting the United States back in its hemispheric box to some extent. And although people think, okay, this is Trump basically giving Iran and China their comeuppance in terms of oil, it's very obvious that the immediate blowback, and it looks to me like the long-term blowback, is actually just about once further dividing the United States from NATO and our European allies,
Exactly.
and making us look not only to our Asian allies as incompetent bullies to some extent on the surface, but even there's this aspect of like where the GCC nations that were beginning to be involved in the Abraham Accords with Israel are being like, oh, the United States really mainly serves the defense interests of Israel. When it comes down to it, Iran is going to successfully be able to target us more than the Israelis, who were the main ones who actually attacked Iran. Now, there's some questions about whether certain of the GCC leadership were also interested, at least in setting Iran back further. They had interest in that too, but to some extent, it basically exposes certain kinds of defense architecture, especially when it's in relationship to the Americans and the Israelis, as a certain kind of paper tiger. And so not only did it give an opportunity for the Russians and the Chinese to target Americans in the region, which it obviously has. And again, I'll just ask, is anybody asking whether the Russians and the Russians and the Chinese are helping the Iranians target their main nemesis in this war, which is Israel? I don't think so. But it's also giving both the Russians and the Chinese an opportunity to suss out American military capacity in relationship to things like deterrence, in relationship to the Pacific and Taiwan and on all of these kinds of things. And at the same time, then you have sort of like the aggression against, like the predicated aggression against Greenland. It comes out that that I believe Denmark was preparing to actually have to militarily defend against the United States in Greenland, and then of course it's sort of like, oh, but we just claimed Venezuela. We got that oil away from the Russians and the Chinese sphere of influence. But meanwhile, it's back into the Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine sphere of influence, while American leadership worldwide it attempted to be set up as some kind of paper tiger and a bumbling kind of thug, rather than some kind of Eisenhower Kennedy style American powerful leadership.
Can I just add how sort of like silly it is that Trump basically like threatened to invade a NATO ally and then started like begging for help like a week ago from NATO? It's like, bro, what are you thinking?
Oh,
it's
absolutely, yeah.
It's like, what are you
I
thinking?
mean, he's constantly talking trash about. The first thing he does is like talk trash about his NATO allies, about Ukraine, Zelensky. I mean, they blame Ukraine and Joe Biden for depleting the ammunition stocks because Joe Biden gave Ukraine like what 350 billion, he said, or something, which is a completely fabricated number as usual. And I mean, he also lifted like sanctions again on countries who buy Russian oil, which is mostly China and India, as far as I'm aware. He now authorizes sale and delivery of Russian oil-loaded vessels. He lifted sanctions on Belarus as well.
Wow.
And Lukashenko was talking about direct flights now between Belarus and the US. Like, how is this not going to be yet another Russian conduit into the US, right? I mean, they claim it was super benevolent, of course, because 250 prisoners were released because of it. And mostly were Belarusians. So, I'm happy for these people, of course, and they're fighting a noble cause. But what does the US stand to gain from this exactly? I mean, the GDP of Belarus is smaller than the state of Delaware. So I find it hard to believe that they did this for benevolent reasons. And, you know, it doesn't really seem to be worth the trade-off, considering how much of a national security risk this could be.
Well, I mean, all of the European neighbors to Belarus had to shut down their borders because it basically became like a human trafficking organization, trying to get all these, Iraqis and Afghanistanis to cross the border illegally into Europe. Like Belarus was a major facilitator of that. So are they going to start doing the same with the United States now? Just start human trafficking people there now? Because it's what Belarus is known for.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, again, the first thing he did was complain about the NATO allies, as always, right? Maybe Europe did wise up and they don't want to get dragged into the Middle East again for a war that's actually rather detrimental to Europe. And then he complains that, NATO is a one-way street, even though I'm pretty sure the only time Article 5 was invoked, it was Europe who assisted the US, not the other way around.
Yeah, the US is the only country that's ever called Article 5 or invoked Article 5. Which is sort of crazy.
And as if protecting Europe isn't extremely beneficial to the US anyway, when Europe is its largest trading and investment partner. And, he always complains about NATO investment, but it's only a fraction of the total US military budget. It's not even 1%.
But by the way, after the United States declared Article 5 after 9/11, there was a white paper that was promised to actually prove that it was more of an external threat than a potential internal threat, because Article 5 does not cover coups, policy coups, as what General Wesley Clark called 9/11, that kind of thing. And I believe that white paper has still never been delivered. But your larger point stands very firmly, which is when the United States needed European allies to discharge their NATO Article 5 duties, people showed up. And it was only when the Iraq War was predicated on falsehoods that emanated out of the commanding heights of basically a cell that was attached to the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans, after 9/11 and the run-up to the Iraq War, an element of the Vice President Cheney's office, especially with David Wurmser, and deeply then connected to Ariel Sharon's office in Israel, that this disinformation drumbeat for Iraq was beat. And then it was at that point then certain European partners said, well, I don't think that this actually involves 9/11 where you claimed Article 5. And you remember we had the whole freedom fries fiasco. And this time around, it was actually the Spanish who eventually they followed the French in the Iraq War. It was the Spanish attempted to be browbeaten. It looked to me like they had a train bombing in 2004, when they were beginning to get finicky around the Iraq War. And it was beginning to become clear that it had been predicated on lies and all that kind of thing. This time around, it was the Spanish who were like, no, this is not a in proper European interest, probably not even an American interest, and we're not going to be involved in it. So in a certain way, and I'm not saying there's not problems in terms of there is also then multipolar, especially Russian influence in elements of Spain and France, but more largely, it seems like they understand the actual threats to Europe, not only from the Russian sphere, but in many ways also from the American-Israeli sphere, increasingly under Trump. And my last thing I'll say is that Greg McCarran and I from The Antidote, we caught that it was not only the Russians who were very interested in Brexit. Now that's sort of become very clear, and how Russian Brexit was, but also how Russian a lot of the political warfare in the European sphere is. But we caught Michael Oren, who was, I believe, the Israeli ambassador to the European Union specifically, who said that Europe was becoming too detrimental to Israeli political interests, and that it needed to be rolled back. So it was sort of a clean break statement by the Israeli ambassador to Europe against Europe, and it seemed to align at a very similar time as what the Russian political warfare interests were in Europe. So I think that's what we see with the rise of Trump MAGA in large part is the rolling out of this Russian-Israeli alignment. A big piece of it is to sort of to roll back European influence. And remember, whatever came out about the Samson option in terms of if the Israelis were geopolitically against the wall, how they would use their nuclear weapons asset, it was basically said that there were European capitals that were potential targets of this. It never said there were American capitals that were targets of it. Now, I have other potential concerns about actually the deployment of things like that in terms of the war on terror. But just on the surface, the Samson option was always predicated against the Europeans. And so, as I pointed out before, that Israel is a fairly unique kind of quote unquote civilian government because of its history as a military garrison warfare state, because of the imperative to serve in the armed forces. You basically have 3 decades almost totally where the leadership, now it's not there's a few in betweens, but almost probably 25 out of 30 years of Israeli leadership all are from this small special forces unit veteran clique of Sayeret Matkal, where Ehud Barak was a commander, Netanyahu was one of his underlings, Naftali Bennett, who recently said that Turkey, another NATO country, was the next Iran because Turkey was setting up a sort of a nuclear-powered Sunni crescent arc of some sort. And then also the head of the Israeli military on October 7th, Herzl Halevi, all part of like a very small special forces, black ops, behind enemy lines special unit that in American context, it would be as if we had like people like Michael Flynn and Stanley McChrystal and only like Green Berets or Delta Force people as our civilian leadership for most of a quarter century. So people need to remember that these people are not just in suits and like civilian leaders. Like it's not a coincidence that when Netanyahu goes and visits, I believe, Boris Johnson, that he leaves an actual listening device in the background. Yeah, because this guy is a black ops reconnaissance spook, in addition to being the prime minister or the crime minister of Israel, as the Israeli streets called him up until October 7th.
Yeah, it's funny how every time there is talks about nuclear weapons, they always mention Berlin, Rotterdam, and Russia does the exact same thing. Like Soloviev, he's always talking about how he wants to nuke Berlin, and and then you get all this rhetoric about how Europeans are just, Nazis, fascists. Now we're cowards too, apparently.
Yeah, funny how that works. Yeah, so I guess all of this. Yeah, like a lot of this kind of begs the question, I suppose. Who, back we were talking about, how these intelligence operations manifest politically, and it seems like, well, the exact same thing has carried on to today. Nothing has really hampered, the sort of progress of these types. If anything, the Trump phenomena is sort of evidence that these kinds of foreign influence campaigns have sort of blossomed, or they're in full bloom now. So I guess what a good conversation to have really is, what exactly is Trump. And I've heard he's a product of military intelligence, that he has his collusions with Russian gangsters and Russo-Israeli gangsters. There's certainly the intelligence angle, and his son-in-law and stuff. But but probably we've already discussed that sufficiently. But perhaps who are all these people maybe that sort of have colluded around him, like uh, Carlson and Candace Owens and Joe Kent and stuff. And to me, it's clear that a lot of them have presented for a very long time some very basic a very basic political face, but they've sort of chopped and changed very much so, to suit themselves, and they've some of them have become very profitable because of that, and maybe some of them see where the wind is blowing. Like I'm not sure what kind of political future JD Vance has, being tied to Donald Trump, as a result of Iran alone, but the whole debacle of the Trump administration, that we've experienced so far. So yeah, sorry. I guess to put that into a simple sentence, who who are these operatives, or are these the new sort of I don't know what you'd like them to, but
The
what
future of the GOP, basically. Like that's what these people are built up as, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, what do we make of these people? Are these people sort of just ferrying Trump along? Are these the agents of the, you know, uh and a permutation of the aims of the Ode Yanon and Clean Break, or essentially the New World Order, or that is being orchestrated, the multipolar order, through these types that have sort of attached themselves to Trump. Has that sparked any interest in anybody's minds? Would somebody like to go first on that?
Well, I think what you're really asking is you started out basically what are his true allegiances? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sure. We can take it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because Jeremy is, I think, the only person I've seen so far who also takes the Mueller report actually seriously and isn't like, trying to straw man it like, oh, it's just a Russia hoax or whatever. But yeah, pretty much everything I know in that regard, I've actually learned from him. So please go ahead.
Well, I'm glad that I think it's important to delve deeply into Trump himself, actually,
Okay.
because to some extent, all of these other people are people who came in after, in terms of the long-term Russian asset Trump. I can't think of any one of these people who was potentially cultivated as a Russian asset before Trump. And so to some extent, they do appear to be coming in to fill the informational and political space in order to bolster their guy Trump. Like even like Joe Kent and Tucker Carlson, everyone's beginning to notice that no matter how true the question of Netanyahu, the Israel lobby, their prodding of the United States, their uh, dominant influence in the United States in terms of things like the war in Iraq, the war in Iran, that they are somehow trying to absolve Trump of any responsibility as the guy who actually makes any of these decisions that somehow always seem to some extent to benefit the Russian sphere. And it is, go for it, sorry.
I was just going to say, that's been going back all the way to like the beginning of his first term. People have been saying stuff like that. It's like, oh, nothing's ever Trump's fault. He has no agency. It's always these people around him.
And then they get offended when their perceived opponents call him a big baby. I mean, well, is he a baby or not, guys? I mean, a baby doesn't really have much agency, does he? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's true. He's like the super baby. Like he's both
Super
a baby
baby.
and he's the Superman. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
the
boss
boss
baby.
baby. Yeah, the boss.
Boss-
You read my
boss
mind. We said it at the same time. That's crazy. The boss baby. Yeah. That's great. That's
But
great. Boss,
it's so true. This is an MO. This is the mode that they used so intensely during Trump 1. That where it's no matter what happens, it's someone else's fault. It's Jared Kushner's fault. It's John Bolton's fault. It's the bad generals who won't serve him. These kinds of things. And so this is an MO of the very Russian sphere, actually, because they're very willing to like push the Israelis under the bus. Like as you'll note, even Trump himself, he said last year, he said, F Iran, F the Israelis, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
He's never been caught saying F Putin. The closest he said is something about, I don't know what he's doing. After, remember, like Trump hosted Putin in Alaska. Trump said that he's going to resolve the Ukraine war within 24 hours. And you just like, this is why I like to sort of look at body language too. It's not prime sourcing, but it's a piece of it. And Helsinki, when after Trump and Putin came out of the room, the physicality is so clear. It's very clear that Putin holds the leash on Trump, the asset. Now, I don't necessarily believe that it's as hardcore as sort of was rolled out as the idea of the Krasnov agent, that Trump sort of actually signed an agent relationship with Russia. It's possible. It's very possible. It's the kind of thing that at the very least Trump knows where his interests are made in terms of being an asset. He knows exactly how much Russian money was laundered through his properties all the way back through the 80s. And so there is even this element, the other side of the cover-up of Trump as a very clear long-term Russian asset during the first Trump years, that was the counter or sort of the parallel or the dialectic with the whole Trump the boss baby idea.
boss baby theory. Yeah.
The boss baby theory was the idea that this was just Russian organized crime, and it was mainly just sort of like Russian Jews who it sort of were mainly serving Israeli interests or something like that. And so a lot of that was actually used as a limited hangout, and it worked on me for at least a couple years. At least like the first year of Trump, I bought into this idea of like, oh, this is just sort of Russian organized crime. There's this sort of Russian-Israeli oligarch connection. But a lot of that now to me looks like it was actually a limited hangout to sort of avoid the Kremlin. Who was the guy who was a former KGB counterintelligence officer working in Germany, working specifically in terms of cultivating assets, turning them into political assets of the Soviet Union in the Western sphere? No, that's Vladimir Putin. Those are the people who surround Vladimir Putin. Sure, there are oligarchs, and there are also Jewish oligarchs, and there's Chabad Lubavitch, which, by the way, it was Putin who basically facilitated the rise of Chabad Lubavitch in Russian Jewish life over against a more diverse forms of Jewish life surrounding the Jewish federations and all of that. And so it was under Putin that this Chabad Lubavitch relationship, which is then often used by this other element to sort of limit the hangout away from like Russian state power. What is the Russian deep state? It does involve Chabad Lubavitch. It does involve oligarchs. It does involve Russian organized crime that is strongly connected going decades back with Israel, Semyon Mogilevich, the whole Tel Aviv meeting in 1994. all of the Russian organized crime and oligarchs who got Israeli passports. That's a piece of it, but that's the underside of the Russian deep state. The top side of the Russian deep state are things like the Kremlin, things like the GRU, things like the SVR, things like long-standing Soviet Maskirovka, active measures, these kinds of things that are actually play out as decades-long chess gambits in many ways, and is not thought of by the Semyon Mogileviches. They are basically the functionaries of the Russian deep state. So I think that it's pretty clear that Trump and his whole movement are not some kind of organic rising populist American movement. They took advantage of a rising American populist moment. But to me, this is pretty clearly synthetic. It was produced on television in many ways. Mark Burnett, who helped produce The Apprentice, was also going to make a reality TV show with Vladimir Putin. So so this is sort of, people
Just a coincidence, I'm sure.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's just my point, is that some of this is basically, this was made to, people talk about Breitbart, made in America, conceived in Israel. That's true. But Trump, made in America, conceived in the Kremlin, I think it's going to really come out.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And then, of course, that, yeah, so many good points there. So many good points. And, of course, that we haven't even touched on the Epstein stuff, and delving deeper into that, how that could be a real feature.
Do the
especially
Epstein
when you
files
consider-
reveal he was working for
Oh,
Russian?
whoops, sorry. I
Do
didn't
the
mean that
Epstein
auto
files?
played. Whoops. Okay. I just wanted to share that tab.
Yeah. No, that's
sorry.
cool.
Keep going. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, we haven't even delved that how that alone could have doesn't just, Trump isn't even the focus on that. Well, he is, because he's the president, but yeah, I mean that could potentially branch out into, so many different elites from all over the world. And I should say, Jeff or Hector, did you guys want to say anything on what Jeremy said?
Yeah, I have a question about Chabad.
Okay.
I mean, clearly Chabad is kind of like almost an intelligence agency by itself, right? I mean, they have like
Yes.
a worldwide network. It's very much centered around a single figure, which is they're sort of like Moshiach, which is Menachem Mendel Schneerson. A lot of people always ask, like, yeah, what is the influence that Chabad really has in Russia? What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's clear that they are a massive influence in Russia, but they were put there. Their position of power in Russia was facilitated by Vladimir Putin, and it's obvious that Putin has this relationship with the Chabad network going back years. And I think you're correct, Jeff, in terms of like that. Chabad is basically the global military intelligence arm of the sort of deep Jewish state to some extent, and it's very clear that they are the ones who facilitate some of the deep relationship between Russia and Israel, Russia and the United States. It's not a coincidence that Trump is surrounded by Chabadis, basically like Jared and Ivanka. It's it's very clear that like they're a crucial player in all of this, and Putin's Rabbi Beryl Lazar shows up in the Trump Russia investigation, and so they're crucial players, and so they both function as not only a power syndicate in Russia, but they also function, like you said, I think, as almost like an independent intelligence kind of global body of some sort.
Yeah, and a lot of people will always say, like, oh, yeah, they don't have any influence in Russia or whatever. But I don't think people seem to realize that even if they are, let's say, the employee of Putin is the employer, whatever, if you provide a lot of value, then you can make certain demands of your employer, So it's not like, even if, which probably is the case, right? Chabad probably works for them more so than the other way around. But it doesn't mean they have zero influence, if you ask me.
Exactly, and because they are a transnational body, they could have all of their power taken in Russia, and they would still be a very powerful global player. And that, I think that's very true what you say, that if you even if you are the asset, or seen as the asset of the Russian deep state to some extent, you still have some amount of power in relationship to that relationship itself. So I think that is very, very clear. And even like Putin's relationship with like other Jewish oligarchs, and this is one of the pieces of evidence that Chabad is not just some kind of, they're not only a front figure for Russian power or something like that, but they actually represent the a deeper element that is even independent from Russia. Is that like Putin's had a relation like Berezovsky, who was not a Chabad Jewish oligarch. He sort of represented another guard of powerful Jewish oligarchs in Russia. Putin was facilitated by Berezovsky into power, and then Berezovsky looks like he lost control of what he thought was his asset, and then Putin basically made him flee. And so there is this aspect of like that. These are uncomfortable kinds of relationships, which are not foundational to either Chabadi power nor Russian deep state power. They are some kind of relationship of convenience and some kind of quid pro quo to some extent, I imagine.
Yeah, a very pragmatic relationship. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Berezovsky because, people like Brother Nathaniel, who basically blame all the world's problems on, Jews as a collective. And from their worldview, it same goes for Kevin McDonald and, what's his name, David Duke. What they always say to kind of like promote Putin into like the far right of the Western Hemisphere, they would basically say, okay, so he kicked out all the Jews from his country, right? It's like, oh, even though it's only Berezovsky, Guzinski, and Khodorkovsky, and they always name these figures, but then not like, what about Roman Abramovich, right? Speaking of Chabadniks, I mean, he is one of the biggest donors of Chabad. He's very close to the Kushners and to Ivanka. His ex-wife was as well. So it's always interesting to me how these people will always claim this, and then to kind of like put Putin on like a pedestal of like some kind of savior against the globalism, because globalism is basically just Jewish power.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. One thing I was thinking about is that in terms of beginning to complete these dialectics, especially like from there's different kinds of disinformation and obscurantism from different kinds of elements. But when you're dealing with Russia, you were almost always dealing with some kind of polar opposite extremification, weaponized dialectics. And so I was thinking of like, we know of Project SIG, which is using the anti-Zionism of the Arab world, and making it more extreme, helping actually connect it with some kind of crude anti-Semitism in the way that you're talking about some of these very Russian sphere, alleged Western sort of critics of the Anglo-American Zio Empire types. That there might be a corollary to that I mentioned before, but I was thinking maybe it could be called Operation Zig. So you have SIG and then you have ZIG, sort of like the Zionist intelligence group, and this would then help explain that even going back to like the Philby affair, I've spoken a little bit about. If you look into what's come from the Matrokin archives into the UK, that it shows that the Soviets actually used Philby, who was one of their highest level agents in Western intelligence. They used him to actually help very specific groups of the proto-Israeli project, mainly the Irgun and the Lehi, successfully bombed the British in the King David Hotel, which included killing British Jews too. So this shows that the Soviets had a weaponized dialectic, a strategic long-term deception operation that would use both sort of crude approach and extremification of anti-Zionism to sort of push it toward crude anti-Semitism on one side, while at the very same time backing and helping escalate the extremist Zionists, the Zionist terrorists, who were mainly seen as an asset to attack the West and to create chaos over a long term in the Middle East. That's my theory of the case, is that the Soviets were the ones who had the most interest and appear to have had the most involvement in actually maintaining what we now call the Israel-Palestine conflict, to be able to put it as not only as an albatross around the neck of especially the American patron, but the West more generally, but also to sort of serve in a proto-clean break fashion to create geopolitical chaos for the sort of Soviet quote unquote main enemy, which was the United States in the Middle East. And so in many ways, this attack on Iran is part of the capstone event geopolitically of, I think, of like something like that kind of like 100-year style plan of Operation SIG, quote unquote V, Operation ZIG from the Soviet sphere.
Yeah, I have I completely agree, by the way, but I have a kind of sort of irrelevant question. What do you think of the whole George Soros situation? Because it kind of reminded me of that, right? Like, they always demonize this guy. He's like the Soviet scapegoat, is what I always like to call him.
He's like a
Yet
pinata.
he is very active in actually destabilizing the West and sort of like forwarding Kremlin goals, it seems.
It's very interesting because I have not yet sort of figured out the full Soros situation. I've only noticed exactly what you're talking about, that he plays the role, or he's put into the role at the very least, of being the Russian pinata, the Russian sphere pinata. I think that's totally accurate because, this whole sort of globalist Soros boogeyman thing was to some extent like operationalized through Hungary and the
Yes.
Orban campaign. And this sits right at the nexus, the axis between Tel Aviv and Moscow in many ways. And it really was like Netanyahu's guys, George Birnbaum, and even Arnon Milchan, his best friend, Arnon Milchan's best friend in Hollywood. They set up a production group, Andy Vanya, who helped Orban rise to power. And a lot of that was done under the guise of the idea of the globalist Soros boogeyman. And then even in an American context, and this is sort of strangely similar to what we pointed out before in terms of, the emphasis on the Guzinskis in terms of the Jewish oligarchs that Putin kicked out. It turned out that probably for their own dirtied up political reasons, but they were the ones who had some qualms about the escalation of the Second Chechen War that Putin was pursuing in the wake of what appears to be on the surface some kind of GRU FSB Moscow false flag bombing to some extent. They were the ones who had some cautionary approach to that. And similarly, I have not yet identified another Jewish billionaire in an American context who was vocally against the Iraq War, other than George Soros. So there is this aspect of it that, at least on the surface, the Jewish globalist billionaire pinatas that are set up seem to be the ones who are against these kinds of more extreme military actions. Now, is it the case that it could be that they actually play this role for a reason that even does serve Russian interests? That's possible. That is possible. And so I just have not yet delved into the background that would prove that out.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, it's just something I noticed because, a lot of people rightfully critique him for, the things that he does fund and promote in the West. It's not nearly as bad as some people would claim, but, he's always the boogeyman. Like Alex Jones, Elon Musk used him as some sort of counterpart, right? Like, oh, I am the George Soros of the right, is kind of what they try to portray him as. And every time it's the same people who go back to, oh yeah, it's just George Soros, and George Soros is the ultimate boogeyman, and Russia banned him in the country. Therefore, Russia is the savior of the world, basically.
And by the way, what's his name, Scott Bessent, he's the head of the Treasury under Trump now. He worked for Soros. By the way, Trump, this is something we pointed out during Trump 1. Trump had his own relationship with Soros. I think investments by Soros in Chicago alongside Trump. But Bessent, it turns out that Bessent actually broke with Soros, the sort of mainstream of Soros's organization, over things like criticism of Israel, criticism of the Iraq War, I believe.
So it's like the only good thing Soros does is what he broke away from.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Like, if we wanted to try to like break the people who are still stuck in some kind of Trump MAGA mind control and are not willing to look at these long facts, one thing would be like, oh, look, there's a Soros boogeyman that he made the head of the Treasury.
Yeah. That's interesting. Apparently they banned him because of a perceived security threat. So, a lot of other things too. But interesting. So he wasn't in line with them. So yeah, very, very interesting. So I guess then, really, maybe succinctly put, what is Trump? And I guess he's the sum of all these intelligence actors that are quite verifiably intelligence actors. I mean, you look at Tucker Carlson and his adoptive father, Dick Carlson, and you've got Owens, and she mirrors a lot of behavior and connections of these sorts of intel networks. And then of course there's Kent and Tulsi Gabbard, who has a lot of funny stuff going along. So
Best friends with
and
Jackson Hinkle.
Hinkle, yeah, and
Oh, no.
RFK, yeah.
Well, she was friends with
he's-
like Assad as well, wasn't she? Like an Assad apologist.
Oh yes.
yeah, she was
And
like
didn't she go to that Italian conference that was sponsored by the Russian agent, basically?
Yeah, Malofev.
Yes, right.
Yes. Yeah,
Right,
that's the one.
right, yeah. And then you have RFK himself, who's like a Habadnik, basically.
Yeah, who
But,
promoted the whole biolabs thing on the Tucker Carlson show, of course, like they all do.
yeah.
Oh.
So yeah, I mean, it's what to really do with all these people, and it really it's almost as if it is. I don't know if it's eclipsed the Republican Party, but it is causing like a really big hole there. I guess the best way to analogize it. But yeah, I guess yeah. What is? I mean, a big question
What is a
for
Trump?
me. What is Trump? But also, like, what is the future of U.S. politics? and just the future of America, and by extension the world, since the world still does revolve around the U.S. I believe, and yeah, especially in the run up to the midterms, like could and it makes me think, it's like it's so terrible, but of course from so many of these networks, these intel networks, these finance or business interests, these military interests, that Trump is probably perceived as a great success, and he's doing entirely what he was intended for. And yeah, I'm just curious as to what you guys might think about what the future is really. As I think we have another 30 minutes, but yeah,
Yeah, we've got about 30 minutes left, and then we'll start to wrap things up.
yeah, and maybe we can touch on Epstein some later, but I think what we did touch on is pretty sufficient. But yeah, especially in the run up to the midterms, I mean, yeah, let me just give like big kind of like Venn diagram bubbles or whatever. In the run up to the midterms, and beyond that, for U.S. politics, and for the future of America, and thus the world. What does what does it look like? I mean, what are we going to deal with after the the advent of Trump? He's gonna has he paved the way for this new kind of wave of funny, clownish, intel assets that I listed before, or is he gonna cause this, such a big rift in the party that it's gonna be like Democrats for forever, or something? Or but yeah, what do you guys think, Jeremy? Would you like to start here?
Jeff
Oh,
is about to go, so
Jeff, yeah, you go, buddy. Yeah, okay.
it's good to have you on, Jeff. We'll have to have you back another time, but thanks for coming on, Jeff. If you want to check out Jeff's links, he can be found at Western Allied Resistance, or was it Western? Sorry, did I get you?
Alliance
Resistance. Yeah, sorry, Western Alliance Resistance. So check out Western.
There you go.
Western Alliance Resistance. Check out Jeff K. We've got his Twitter and the link of the YouTube and Rumble and everything. So check him out. It's good to have you on, Jeff, and we'll have to have you back another time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was nice meeting you, Jeremy. Very knowledgeable, very interesting. I've actually listened to your Antidote podcast for quite a long time now, so it was very nice talking to you.
I appreciate your work a lot, Jeff. And good to talk to you.
Thank you. All right.
Awesome.
See you later, guys.
Peace, man. Thanks for
Bye.
coming, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, that's dang. But oh well, we've got Jeremy, so that's that's the main thing. So all right, so yeah, just to reiterate, what is in terms of the near future for the U.S. and long term, I mean,
Basically, is the GOP cooked? Is the way
as
to
the
put it.
GOP cooked, and I also want to. I mean, I wonder if Jeremy would hone what I had to say earlier in the broadcast, that Netanyahu is basically on his way, or Israel is on its way to total ascendancy in the Middle East, and between these great powers. So arguably, the world, they have quite firmly nestled themselves a nice nest egg in the world, and they have achieved and then that is to say, however,
Can I just say, with Israel, they've even started like antagonizing people they thought were like former partners or potential partners, like Turkey. Like it's sort of like for years the Israelis saw Turkey as like a potential partner to help maintain, like contain all these other regimes in Syria, Iran, Iraq, wherever. And now they're like, got some pretty hostile rhetoric towards it, towards Turkey in particular, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, they do seem to view Turkey as a threat. People mention Turkey's sizable military, but I wonder if there's more. I mean, Erdogan does seem, at least on the surface, very critical of a lot of what Israel has done, and there is that lack of trust that a lot of Middle Eastern and Arab and that sort of broader region has towards Israel. That it's less than frosty in their relationship, let's say, but they still deal with them. So I wonder if there's anything deeper, and maybe as an aside, Jeremy could comment on that. But I guess to stay on topic, unless he wants to lead on that first. I mean, yeah, and back to what you said, Hector. It's like it's worked for them thus far for decades. So, why would they? And it's worked for the Russians for the longest time. So I guess they can just keep going with it, perhaps. I don't know. Seems to work thus far, but yeah. Sorry, I digress. If maybe Jeremy might want to lead with that as an aside, or maybe he'd like to delve deeper into that. But yeah,
Sure.
I'm just yeah, and that could give us an indication as to perhaps the unstumpable sort of surge forward to the Israel building its uncontested power, and which to me, perhaps I'm still a little hazy between the it sometimes it's difficult for me to understand Tel Aviv, Moscow, are these twins, or is it one twin over the other, like a Jacob and Esau sort of dynamic? I don't know. Maybe Jacob, that's probably a bad analogy, but is it like a yeah, is there one over that is has more governance, more leverage over the other? I mean, once upon a time, I would have said that's Moscow, but increasingly, it seems that the twin relationship seems to be more Israel sort of leading the way in the sort of surge forward to creating a world that isn't governed by the United States and Europe. But anyway, sorry, I
I
digress.
actually do think the Jacob and Esau analogy is actually sort of good. Well, that's what I
It's
thought so
pretty
anyway.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, we can use that. Why not? But so there's that. But yeah, sorry, I'm rambling. I realize that, believe it or not. So we've got the Turkey aspect that came up recently, and you know, what does the world look like? With all this power, all this energy that we've discussed in this broadcast going one way, politically, geopolitically, and intelligence-wise. What does that look like for America? And the the power broker. I wonder if we could touch on that. Has that shifted, and how how has that dynamic shifted, if at all, and or is it on an even footing? Jeremy, I'm sorry. Would you like to comment on that? Go ahead.
Yeah. The, maybe we could get back to Jacob and Esau. That's an interesting question
Okay.
in terms of Moscow and Tel Aviv. And then you got to throw in something like Isaac and Ishmael, because that's
Yes.
always the
Yep.
deeper aspect of of
Mm,
Islam and Judaism. Is that relationship is there?
hmm,
And it does seem clear to me that there, whatever the nature of the relationship between the Russian sphere and the Israeli sphere, that part of, and this might be related to the question of the relationship of the Kremlin to Chabad to some extent too. But at the very least, the interaction, the exchange, the quid pro quo relationship was that there was a desire for each sphere to fulfill their interests. And so the Russian sphere really was that the reason why they had such deep relationships with people like Ariel Sharon, I believe Netanyahu, like the Israeli streets have called him KGB before. And I imagine that they actually probably have more knowledge of this. And the deep Soviet penetration of Israel goes back decades and is way deeper than is popularly known, I imagine. But the Russian sphere sought to create itself as the third and final Rome to some extent, right? And so that is obviously in relationship to the idea of the building of the third temple from the Israeli side of things. So I think that question is interesting in terms of, well, who is on the ascendant or who has bigger global aspirations, who is in the command in terms of power, is it something more horizontal? So I think those things we should moving forward delve into to some extent. But the real the real moment of geopolitics right now is very delicate and very dangerous because of all of these splintering relationships, including what you all were talking about in terms of Israel and Turkey. Now, Turkey, obviously there was, I think it was last year or something like that, there was NATO exercises, and Israel wanted to be involved in the NATO exercises, but I believe Turkey had basically made sure that Israel was not involved in those NATO exercises. And so it's pretty clear that there has been a growing friction, at the very least, between Israel and Turkey. Now, Turkey has been an uneven NATO ally to some extent, and there were, especially before, in maybe the half decade before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or maybe a decade, there were lots of questions about what role is Turkey going to play here in terms of NATO and the Russian sphere and all that. Now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it seems like the Turks realized that they had a lot more interests that aligned with NATO than they did with the Russians, particularly around the question of the Black Sea, and that the Russians were making a play to become the sort of sole dominant power in relationship to that region, which the Turks also butt up against. And so at that point, it looked like the Turks were attempting to, follow some of their own national interests by getting more fully allied with NATO and the United States. So I do think that the Israelis do not like at this point the ascendancy of Turkey and the Turks' close relationship as an integral member of NATO. Increasingly, obviously, there's a very important U.S. military base there that includes nuclear weapons. And so we've seen that there's been these kinds of questions of, there's a lot of people in the region questioning when Iran is said to have attacked someone like Turkey. The people begin to look at it and say, well, is this really, there's some kind of false flag aspect to this. So there's a lot of more eyes on these kinds of deeper matters than I think there has been, at least publicly, for many years. So that's a good thing to some extent. And but this is a very dangerous moment because I think we are at peak U.S.-Israel special relationship, and that's obviously the entire younger voting populace in the United States has, especially since the Israeli response to October 7th in Gaza, has begun to really be way more critical in relationship to the U.S.-Israel special relationship. And it's obviously been more exaggerated within the Democratic Party base and the young people in the Democratic Party base, where now even like someone like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who is seen as maybe the leading potential candidate for the Democratic Party for president, big APAC guy from way back, he was just sort of casually floating Israel apartheid state, that kind of thing. And so at the very least, this is an obvious understanding by the DNC political elite, I think, that they cannot resist the winds of change from their base much longer, where they had been, like, just especially in the last years, sort of voting almost diametrically to the base. The base is sort of like 90% versus 10% in favor of at least rethinking or rechecking the U.S.-Israel special relationship, using American power to discipline the alleged the Israeli ally and all of that, whereas the actual Democrats in Congress were sort of voting 90-10 against that to some extent. And I think that now will the Democrats are cynically political when they need to be, when they're not acting like as the Washington Wizards and actually like seemingly playing the role of the losers for these kind of big foreign sponsored political coups. I think like to someone like Trump. Alongside what's called the mainstream media, like there was a lot of talk of like the mainstream media hate Trump and all that, and yet they never exposed any of the things that actually would have helped really bring Trump down in the
Yeah.
eyes of the populace.
No, keep going. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
I just really agree. Sorry. Yeah, go.
No, so I think that there is this political moment, and this is not isolated to the Democrats, the younger Republicans, maybe even in a more organized fashion, in some ways a more culturally extreme fashion. If you think about the rise of Nick Fuentes and the Groypers, that there is a reckoning at the base of the Republican Party too, which obviously sort of came to a head in the conversation in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination and all of that. And on the surface of it, it looked like, Charlie Kirk was a good soldier for the Republican Party and the younger voting base, and that's the reason why he went to campuses. That's why he sponsored sort of alleged debates about public issues, which were mainly sort of done as a sort of influencer kind of relationship against younger minds, less experienced minds, rather than an actual intellectual grappling with, deep facts and policy. But he was clearly like a loyal soldier of the Republican Party, and he knew which way the wind was blowing when it came to some of the base that he needed to keep in the tent. In terms of at least acknowledging that there was a debate about the U.S.-Israel special relationship at the very least. And so he, that sort of came to the surface that he was dealing with these kinds of things as probably the main, point person for the young Republicans. So there is this moment. And then, of course, what's not talked about a lot in the United States is that, and this is an area where I've sort of quietly, not quite professionally enough, but I've been advocating for this, what I call a radical middle in independent position in the United States. And it came up that actually last year or 2 years, a year and a half ago, the United States reached a place where the dominant plurality of voters in the United States were independents, not Republicans nor Democrats. And yet somehow this all then continues to get fed into two-party politics. And so one of the deepest questions in terms of where the rubber meets the road of like whether we could actually have a moment that I think we should have, like where the United States at this moment where the U.S.-Israel special relationship has reached its apparent apex, maybe its most toxic apex, at least globally and publicly, in terms of the global economic immediate blowback to almost all sectors to some extent in terms of the actual international economy in relationship to the attack on Iran, that this is a moment where you would think that the United States would, if we actually were the indispensable global superpower and not just sort of being directed into some kind of way of sort of thrashing around wildly while handing the reins over to a sort of troika of multipolar new world order powers, which is basically China, Russia, and the United States kept in its hemispheric box. Forget the Europeans, forget what's called the global South. And then Israel is this middle player that potentially holds the keys to the Mackinder World Island epicenter, technologically, cyber, economics kinds of relationships and all of that. So if we were not to just be sort of follow our intended fate here as the United States, we would actually want to see an America that pursues peace with power rather than so-called peace through strength. And we would see a disciplining at the very least of what should very obviously be a junior partner
Oh yeah,
of Israel.
it's sort of crazy that doesn't happen, but I don't know.
which is why people understandably begin to think about things like covert operations, espionage, mass compromise, and in my eyes, I've always wondered about questions of sort of the covert aspects of Samson option type of threats in relationship to Israeli superpower around cyber and this long-term high technology aspect of where now it's getting really crazy in the United States in terms of, you know, Silicon Valley, which is obviously the missing sort of major third piece behind this second Trump you know, White House. Is that's obviously the Russians are still really interested. The Israelis obviously very interested. There's other players, obviously internationally. There's a lot of very strong, very corrupt interests of players in the Trump White House, including people like Witkoff and Kushner with the Arab powers and all of that. But really, it's these three main powers that help facilitate or are interested in the facilitation of the second rise of Trump. Which, by the way, you know, going back to this question of the Mueller report and Trump Russia and all that, this is so, I feel so like living in a gaslit situation of like people totally forgetting. Yeah, we had a special prosecutor who investigated the facts around the background of January 6th and the 2020 elections and felt there was way enough evidence to indict Trump for conspiracy to defraud the United States of America. Okay, that is a very serious charge for someone who just sort of then gets put back into power. No one really looks again at the elections too much. And the question of all of these bomb threats that happened on election day in 2024, how could it be that every single swing state sort of went weird in the same exact kind of way, the same kind of things that we see happen in Russian elections or in prior American elections when these very same kind of players were apparently involved in things like election fraud and all that. So we are living in this very dangerous kind of epistemological vacuum of some sort where we do not reckon really frontally with how much fraud and how much corruption and how much foreign influence has been involved in actually facilitating this specific character back into the White House along with his whole crew. And so I guess I'll just finish up by saying that I still think that in an American context, the way to unhook a lot of this dialectical warfare is obviously by transcending the dialectical approach or the either or approach. And this, you know, the Washington, you know, our first president basically warned of what happens if the American constitutional republic is handed over to a party system. And that was just sort of like under like, well, it could be all kinds of parties. It'd definitely be more than two, but there'd probably be two dominant parties, but there'd be a bunch of parties. But the main idea was that instead of the idea of individual responsibility, individual rights, combined with the national interest, the idea of cooperative American responsibility to each other, you then replace party loyalty rather than someone's actually good faith, functioning heart and mind, and then what their hands and feet would do in relationship to their own conscience to many ways, let alone their own vision of how to actually fix our economic, our political, our ecological problems, all those kinds of things. So I still think that the real deep solution to the American conundrum is held in the independence, in the heart of the independence, in the heart of the radical middle, in many ways, that understand the difference of political philosophy that people approach from sort of a more right wing or a more left wing, conservative, liberal kind of approach, but think through things like principles and actual policy, like what can we actually do to fix our problems in a way that doesn't necessarily, we don't have to ban parties, it's not that kind of thing, but we have to transcend parties. And so we have to create a way in which people can actually come together in a where they could still run as a Republican or Democrat, at least until we fix the the election system, the party funding system, the governing system, the way it all plays out in Congress and all of that, but that we could actually create a vision where the independents can begin to assert we're this American superpower politically right now, and yet we're still just being drawn off into some kind of axis of resistance kind of types on the left, or
Yeah.
some kind of Maha RFK subsumed by Trump on the right, and all of those kinds of things. So there are possibilities. I don't yet see exactly how we get from here to there, but I know that we could, there are ways to get there, but I don't know what they are yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Whoa. That was epic.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
really
we've
good.
got about 10 minutes left in the show. I mean, that was
Mm.
like a great
That was
summary.
really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess while we're talking about the future, what do you think the future of this Iran conflict will be? Will it be like are we going to see boots on the ground? Is it going to wrap up in a couple months? Is there going to be some sort of like negotiated peace, or is the bombings just going to continue until, I don't know, Iran gives up, which probably won't happen. But what do you see as the most likely plausible outcome for this conflict, and how will that affect the current Trump regime and American politics and world politics as a whole?
Well, my hope in the short term is that the self-interest of Trump and Putin, for the time being, would actually win out potentially over the Netanyahu interest in the short term, which would be Trump realizes that he has gotten himself way in over his head. And he's, very quickly, people who voted for him are now calling him the worst president ever, potentially, let alone what that means for the midterms, let alone what that means for him being potentially impeached, and all of that kind of thing, that I think just personally, he does not want that for himself. And then, I already saw the indication from the early days of the Iran war that Trump, like I said before, Trump was sort of setting up Russia to be the beneficiary of this. And so in the short term, what that could look like is that Trump basically, we saw this call already happen where Trump said that Putin wants to be helpful. And so I get the sense that this is Trump's potential off ramp, is that he can bring Putin in. Putin will be like, along with sort of Xi in the background, they will be the peacemakers and all of that, and sort of settle this down before it destroys the entire world economy, before it devolves into a total major regional conflict, and all of that. Now, I don't know if that will happen, because part of the problem is that there are these strong elements in the US government and the Israeli government that really want to go further here. And it's clear that they are already, just at the very least, thinking about, well, how do we get the Strait of Hormuz back and reopened? We have to get some, boots on the ground and all of that. So that, at the very least, it looks like they're going to be doing that. And the problem too is now Iran is accused of being sort of savage and nutty, and they do have the religious regime is obviously very severe, and it's very severe on their own people. But the main thing that they think about is the preservation of the regime itself, and so they're still rational actors. And so part of the problem is that they sort of under responded to some extent to prior threats, like where they would exactly, just sort of very limited responses to both Midnight Hammer last year and the bombing of the nuclear sites, and the assassination of Soleimani, where they would basically tell the Americans that what they were going to do, and then they did it, and that was it. And so right now, the Iranians appear to think that they're in a situation where they need to reset the balance of power in the Middle East, and reset the escalation ladder in terms of, so that they don't face this in the future, especially now that they have been severely weakened in terms of their ballistic missile sites. Now, they're not as weak as some may say, I think, and obviously, like the the regime itself is fairly distributed. It has lots of layers of ability to create its own orders,
It's
especially in
anti-fragile,
response.
right? I mean, it's not like just killing one person was going to collapse the regime. I don't know why people thought that would happen, but
That's a great way of putting it. It is, there is this aspect of it being anti-fragile, and yet it also is sort of easily then pushed into further extremism at the same
Mhm.
time. The regime itself is anti-fragile, and it's obviously the case if you take out their sort of supreme leader, who's also a religious icon of some sort, that also it relates to religious, prophecy to some extent. You're only going to harden this anti-fragile entity to some
Mm,
extent. And so in general, my thinking is that we need to, even in relationship to like the Russian dialectics, the weaponized dialectics, we need to understand the way that extremism is pushed across the entire sort of environmental landscape of politics, and that you'll see that like we were talking about before, whether it's Operation SIG or Operation ZIG, it's very much the multipolar New World Order interest to make things really extreme as possible, especially on the edges, so as that there is not to be some kind of actual rules or principle based order or things like diplomacy or actual political solutions and all of that. So I don't know who all's going to win out here. I hope at the very least that some saner minds will prevail. But I think we're already not even prepared for at the very least, the economic consequences that have already been
uh,
set into motion.
yeah, yeah.
well, I think it does seem somewhat likely that the Americans are going to send Marines to a lot of these Iranian islands, like Krag Island, maybe like some other ones that are like Hormuz Island that are closer to the strait itself, or the really big island, I believe it's called Question Island. That would be a big invasion, but maybe that's a bit too big. But it does seem like at the moment that the US is massing Marines for at least some island invasions in the Strait and the Persian Gulf right now. So it seems like that's the likely next step, which was again another escalation. So that's more of an escalation than, you know, a ceasefire. So it looks like it's going in that direction, at least from what it looks like.
Hmm. Yeah, I think they're already massing them. Yeah. So, okay, that's good. Awesome. So, do you want me to wrap it up and then you can end the stream, Hector?
Yeah, well, if Jeremy has any final
Yeah.
words for the
Final
next
word.
5 minutes, then
Hmm.
we'll wrap it up.
Well, thank you both very much for having me on, and I appreciate you bringing Jeff into it too. And so we are at the dire times in many ways, and yet there is this aspect of where I keep seeing that there's a lot of these kinds of very destructive, dangerous, dark plans that were meant to happen much earlier on a much quicker timeline, and that includes everyone from our own, I think, seditious aspects of oligarchs and the American technate types,
Mm,
and in the sort of the axis between Silicon Valley and the dirtier parts of Wall Street that seek some kind of Trump pump and dump operation of some sort. They have been wanting something like this for a long time in terms of the sort of vulturistic predation of the American body politic and American infrastructure and all of that, where they can sort of siphon up and away the wealth of the common people to some extent. So that's in the mix, and that's on a sort of a longer timeline than a lot of people wanted. The Russian and Israeli timelines are also way behind. There are signs that they are concerned about the exposure of people, like their assets, like, or agents like Dugin,
mm,
or their assets like Trump, and then there is this upside to people from October 7th now to the Iran war beginning to really understand and question the negative dynamics of the U.S.-Israel special relationship. So in a certain way, what like Greg and I from the Antidote used to call the alt-light, alt-right dialectic that would both run cover for Trump One was sort of more sort of crudely anti-Jewish, maybe. The other was sort of what you might call Zionist or philo-Semitic, the alt-right. That window has shifted. And now that doesn't mean that there's not still a lot of danger, because like I was talking about before, that sometimes when the window shifts, it really is just sort of making things more extreme. And when you make things more extreme, not only do you create more chaos at the edges, but you also open up more vacuum in the middle for these dark forces to come in and capture people's minds and hearts. But just on the surface, I think that the fact that the alt-right and the alt-light right now has shifted from sort of a polarity around Zionism to some extent to just different versions of questioning the U.S.-Israel special relationship on one hand, and then a different relationship to how they're going to run cover for Assad Trump on the other. That just that shift in the mainstream discourse represents that there are openings and that follow along with what I was talking about before, of that we're now reaching the independent plurality dominance in the United States. And so, culture always leads to some extent, and I really think about it as political culture leads politics in terms of elections and governing and policy and all of that. So there, it was the best of times and the worst of times, is I guess what I'm saying.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
Okay.
great way to wrap it up for us. Thanks for that. So yeah, it was great to have you on, Jeremy. We hope to see you back again. You're extremely knowledgeable about the topics that you specialize in, and mate, we need more people like you
Yeah.
in the Trump
Yeah.
administration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I think
There
would it
need
be
to, be like a Roth-Kushel school of thought,
yeah.
established or something like that. I don't know, but yeah.
I just
Sorry.
want to say it's so good to have allies out there and colleagues like the two of you,
Oh,
Gilbert
thank
and
you.
Hector, like especially in terms of like the Anglophonic world, and from the southern hemisphere, and I feel like we're sort of on the opposite sides of the world to some extent, but we both represent like the sort of the growing heart of aspects of humanity sort of gaining our power back, and it starts in heart and mind, but then it will then translate into feet and hands and action.
Amen. Amen. Excellent way to put it. Yeah. Hold that thought, and if you can, if you gotta go, you gotta go. But if you can, hang around a little bit after the stream. I just want to talk to you very briefly, if you can spare that amount of time.
Sure.
Thank you, thank you.
All
But
right. Oh,
I'll
sorry.
just close. Do you want me to close out, or do you?
Oh, you can, Gilbert. Go for it.
Okay, so a big thank you to Jeremy Rothe-Kushel and Jeff K for joining us and sharing their insights. There's a lot to think about here, and I'd highly encourage everyone watching to take the time to explore their work further. And, the situation in the Middle East is clearly evolving. And as we've discussed, it's not just about isolated events, but how these developments fit into a much, much broader geopolitical picture. So, if you found this conversation valuable, please be sure to follow, share, and stay tuned. We'll definitely be having them back on at some future point, and we'll continue bringing on voices who can help break down these complex issues in a serious and thoughtful way. So, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you for the next one. And I'll let Hector close us out.
Oh, thanks for everyone tuning in. Thanks for watching. Great to have you here and watch the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe, press the bell button, and follow us on whatever platform you're watching. Hope that you enjoyed the show, and we see you next time. We're going to do it more regularly. We had about a 3-month gap from our last episode. To be fair, we had some guests leave on us. We had some technical issues. We tried to do episode like 61. This is probably the 4th attempt, but 4th time's the charm. But we're going to do this more regularly again. We're lining up more guests. We got some more stuff for you. Remember to like and subscribe. Turn on that notification button. Thank you for tuning in. Catch everyone next time.